Bonnet Stigler, and the philosophy of education. He is currently writing several volumes on schizoanalysis and post-media and published Thinking with Animation with Catherine Zhu Yu Cheng in 2021. Over to you, sir.
Thank you very much for that. I'm very conscious of time, so I want to get on and listen to our three speakers today who are going to discuss about abstract life and philosophy. So without further ado, I'll just introduce very briefly the speakers. So the first speaker is Angeles Maria del Rosario Perez Benal from the Autonomous State University of Mexico. And following her is Keith Robinson of the University of Arkansas in America. And then we have Gray and Kanto Coca Lindgren, who are making a collaboration. Gray is from the University of Hong Kong, and Kanto is based in Seattle, working on dance and theatre there. So without further ado, can I pass over to Dr. Benal, please, to have her speak?
Yeah, thank you. I would like to share my screen. Is it possible?
Yes, please go ahead. I've enabled screen sharing.
Okay, thank you. Okay, here it is. Well, I'm going to talk about, the life of things or the subversion of history in the literature of Jorge Luis Borges. Here I combine the philosophy of Gilles Deleuze and literature, in this case, a Latin American literature, very famous, whose name is Jorge Luis Borges. And well, let me tell you that there are more than a few stories where Jorge Luis Borges performs a subversion of actors capable of altering the conventional historical narrative. That is to say, stories where the objects manifest life, will, and even their own purposes that go beyond the sphere of influence and action of men who interact with them. The present paper seeks to analyze the non-organic lives present in the short stories called The Encounter, The Sahir, Blue Tigers, The Library of Babel, and The Lottery in Babylon, by, as I told you, the Argentine author Jorge Luis Borges, which can be examined from the Leibnizian categories explained by Gilles Deleuze of perspective, sufficient reason, inclusion, and incompossibility. The aim of this is to know how they unfold in nature and in history, assuming a role that allows them to substantially modify their context. The methodology I use is to analyze the short stories mentioned above, assigning them a guiding Deleuzian concept to a specific story. For The Encounter, I use the concept sufficient reason. For The Sahir, I use the concept of perspective. For Blue Tigers, inclusion. And in the Library of Babel and the Lottery in Babylon, I use incompossibility. So let's start with the first short story called The Encounter. The Encounter is a story where objects and the dynamics between them are the core of the events. In this case, it is about two weapons that seek each other to fight and settle an old dispute between two men, Juan Almanza and Juan Almada. The important point is that these men are already dead when the events of the story take place. In fact, the dispute on which the narrator focuses is between Maneko Uriarte and Duncan, who became instruments to accomplish an old fight that never took place between Almanza and Almada, and the intention was kept in the weapons. In fact, as you can see, the narration emphasizes the preponderant role of these weapons. The most emblematic sentence in the story is the one that says, "Weapons, not men, fought." Well, for Leibniz, he speaks of a Baroque grammar where the event is as sufficient reason. This sentence that I have just read, "Weapons, not men, fought," is used by Borges to reinterpret the Baroque character that Deleuze describes, and I'm going to quote, that the predicate verb, and the verb is irreducible to the copula and the attribute. That is even the basis of the Leibnizian conception of the event. The first time that the event was worthy of being elevated to the status of a concept was in the Stoics, who did not consider it an attribute nor a quality, but the incorporeal predicate of a subject of the proposition. Not "the tree is green," but "the tree greens." This is the end of the quote. So we have in the encounter this principle of sufficient reason, because the principle of sufficient reason includes the event as a predicate. In the story, there's an impeccable display of narrative operations that are aroused not by men, the usual actors, but by the objects. It is the weapons that meets, and it is the weapons that actually fight. So we have it here. Maneko Uriarte looked for the most colorful and longest weapon in a collection they were seeing. He chose that of the U-shaped hawk, and Duncan chose a wooden cape knife. And the weapons then guide the actions. So the weapons find each other and fight. And that's why we find the principle of sufficient reason and the Baroque grammar in this short story. In the second story, the Scythe, the concept to be used will be that of perspective, posed by Leibniz and reinterpreted by Deleuze. This story describes what the Scythe is in Argentina, a 20-cent coin, but in addition, it is also many other things like diverse antique objects. The text starts by describing the funeral of Teodelina Villar and how the narrator was affected. When leaving the service, he gets the Scythe in a change, which from now on will not cease to be at the center of his thoughts, even completely taking over of his memories. The category of perspective, in short, consists of the particular vision of a subject facing an event. However, from the Baroque grammar, there is no longer properly a subject facing on an object, but a subject that has become perspective due to an event. In the story, the preponderant role is assumed by the Scythe, but it acquires coordinates that the story assigns it beforehand, such as the death of Teodelina Villar. The narrator then becomes himself a perspective because of his death that is transfigured by the multiplicity that turns out to be the Scythe. As Deleuze explains, it is not a variation of truth according to the subject, but the condition under which the truth of a variation presents itself to the subject. The Scythe is an acting object whose will surpasses the personal history of the narrator and Teodelina. In other words, the life on which the story revolves is the Scythe as currency under its multiple meanings that the narrator does not cease to deploy in all its mystical, historical, and religious machinery, which nevertheless becomes that which does not change, that which is fixed, and which, as an object, takes the center of the story and its very particular dynamics, a situation that exemplifies and explains the ending that you can see there in a quote. To lose themselves in God Sufis repeat their own name, or the 99 divine names until these no longer mean anything. I long to walk that path. Perhaps I will end up spending the Zaire by dint of thinking and rethinking it. Perhaps God is behind the coin. The narrative subversion lies in how this coin alters the teleology apparently set in motion by the characters, acting subjects of the story. It is no longer about the narrator's story in the face of Teodelina's death, but about this multiple coin that may or may not represent the multiple faces of God, or the secret of death or of transcendence, to mention a few examples. The Leibnizian concept of inclusion may well be worked out in the story Blue Tigers, insofar as the signifier tiger within the story does not possess the schema subject-verb attribute. This implies that it is an object, which again takes the role of the protagonist in the story. But it is necessary to remember that its status as an object does not imply essence or substance. In this story, a professor named Alexander Craig maintains an ordinary life until he is assaulted by the will of the blue tigers. First in his dreams with tigers as animals, and then in reality within the story with tigers as blue stones. How are these blue stones of the text paired with inclusion? Leibnizian inclusion, I quote, is based on a subject-verb complement scheme, which has resisted since antiquity the scheme of attribution, a Baroque grammar, in which the predicate is first and foremost relation and event, not attribute, end of quote. As Deleuze explains, in analogous, these blue stones do not have a specific attribute. The supposed blue attribute, as the narrator explains, in a dream I saw tigers of a blue I had never seen before and for which I could not find the right word. I know it was almost black, but that circumstance is not enough to imagine the hue, end of quote. Nor is it even because of its numerical value that could be thought of as obvious from the direct experience of Alexander Craig. Instead, the text abounds in the descriptions of how the nature of these blue stones, rather than elusive, is indeterminate by their autonomy of their will. There's a quote here. There are mathematicians who claim that 3 and 1 is a tautology of 4, a different way of saying 4. It had fallen to me, Alexander Craig, to discover among all the men on the earth, the only objects that contradict that essential law of human mind. That's how reflects the character of this story of Jorge Luis Borges. In this case, the Baroque grammar that has already been explained exemplifies the particularity of being the point of reference capable of exerting a power of influence on the characters that get in contact with the stones. The inclusion articulates the preceding concepts. Alexander Craig's perspective in the face of the event of the blue tigers opens the space towards incompossibility, the chaosmos enunciated by Deleuze, and whose most exalted stories capable of evidencing them are the Library of Babel and the Lottery in Babylon. And here we go with those stories. Deleuze calls incompossible two series that diverge and therefore belong to two possible worlds. The monads, which express worlds that cannot be combined. For example, Adam as not a sinner. That's a world that is not this one that we inhabit. So these features are the very structures of both the library and the lottery in the texts analyzed. The Library of Babel is a story where the universe is understood as a library, a composition of rooms, aisles, shelves, and books, All the possible books exist there. That is, the library incorporates all possible combinations of books that have ever existed. The Lottery in Babylon, in a very similar tone, tells the story of the evolution of the lottery as an institution able to regulate society in every aspect, which is just a way of institutionalizing chance itself, even for the very mechanisms of the lottery or the possibility of really knowing its nature. I propose to organize the analysis as follows. The series that diverge and therefore belong to two possible worlds, that's number one, and monads which express worlds that cannot be combined, as the example, Adam not a sinner. Well, the series that diverge and therefore belong to two possible worlds, in the Library of Babel, the library of itself is a series in which, for example, finding a book opens two possible worlds. And here's a quote: the impious affirm that nonsense is normal in the library, and the reasonable. Sorry?
Is it true?
Is it time?
It's not. You have 5 minutes left, but whoever's got their mic on, please turn it off.
Yeah, I'm almost finished. Thank you. So this quote is the example of how library itself is a series. And in the Lottery of Babel, on the other hand, the lottery itself is also a series. The complex mechanism makes it omnipresent, but also difficult to locate. And here is a quote of the story. No decision is final, they all branch into others, says the story. And the example of monads are, in the case of the Library of Babel, the galleries, corridors, books, and even the scriptures are monads. For example, two books may diverge by offering one word where Adam sins and another where he does not. And also monads in the Lottery in Babylon are the company, the rules, and every game of chance. And here we have that Borges explains that maybe the company never existed or will not exist. That's another possibility. So the story annuls itself. So as a conclusion, I have that the relevance of Leibnizian tools recovered by Gilles Deleuze to describe the dynamics of things and objects within the stories is evidenced, and applying Deleuze's concepts to Borges' literature has shown two vital aspects to be able to analyze the narrative dynamics that structures them. So subversion operates as a mechanism that removes men's prominence from the story and transfers it to things. In any case, the role of the objects become protagonist and modifies the lives of the characters themselves and the universal history. For this reason, these objects could be classified as non-organic lives whose deployment in nature and in history gives them the role of actants that significantly dislocate the order of things and men. And the other conclusion is that stories not only show a Baroque grammar in their narrative discourse, but also make evident the presence of the divergent and the incompossible. In order to know the intrinsic relationships between literature and philosophy within the short story corpus of the Argentine writer, the concepts used have revealed how Borges has put philosophical truths to test with his fictions in order to dismantle them. So the will that prevails in history is that of the object, not that of the knowing subject. There, Borges offers a radically subversive view of reality. Thank you very much for your attention.
Dr. Bernal, thank you very much. That is outstanding. I have some questions of my own, but I think we're going to have the questions at the end of the talks, if that's agreeable with the presenters, because as I said, I'm quite conscious of the time. So if we may proceed. The next person to speak is Professor Robinson, who I briefly introduced before. So again, without further ado, Keith, over to you. perhaps need to put your mic on.
His video and mic is on, but we're not able to.
Oh,
Maybe we can go ahead with the other presenter, and then we can come back to Keith Robinson for the third presentation.
Keith, when you say something, could you say something? Right. Well, your sound is off, okay, at the moment. So if it's okay, could you have a look at the sound, and then you perhaps could go at the end? Is that okay? Right. Well, then I'm sorry about that. That's technical glitches as ever. So if it's okay with Gray and Kanto, Koka Lindgren, could you perhaps begin your presentation?
Can everybody see that? Okay. So thank you so much for the invitation. It's fantastic to be here. And we'll move pretty quickly through this. As you'll notice, I think for you, there are also captions on the bottom of the screen. Kanto's hard of hearing, so we're using the captions to help her keep up. We're going to talk about inflecting the monochromatic infinite because we wanted to inflect something from the title of the conference, and infinity is something I don't understand much, and I love the phrase monochromatic infinite. Basically, what we're trying to do is look at 5 pages in chapter 7 of What is Philosophy on percept, affect, and concept, and then move from a very quick passageway through Deleuze and French painting. Then we'll switch to Kanto, and she'll talk about Hong Kong and India and the work she's done there. And then we'll just conclude very briefly at the end about the ear of the future. And throughout, we're going to try to keep these terms flesh, house, and cosmos in interaction with each other. Again, this just comes out of those 5 to 8 pages in chapter 7. So inflection, this is something everybody knows. But we just wanted to mention cadence, rhythm, accentuation, modulation, crook, arc, and arch, because this already binds together the act of thinking, the act of living, and artistic forms from painting to dance, etc. And we wanted to start with the ocean, just to do a quick line from Leibniz through Kant's Sublime to maybe Nietzsche and Melville, and then on into Deleuze and Guattari, and this notion of chaos and its relationship to making art and to thinking. So flesh, house, cosmos. It is the flesh that is freed from the lived body and the perceived world, and the intentionality of one that is still too tied to experience. So this is partly connected to what Jeff was talking about earlier about a phenomenological subject. We know Deleuze and Guattari want to move beyond that. And so will the flesh be adequate? And what does it mean if it's not what we would take it in everyday givenness of life? Can it support percept and affect? Can it constitute sensation? Or does there need to be another form of support? And Deleuze and Guattari in this chapter think there does need to be another form of support, something to make it hold fast. And that's a very interesting term, and that the flesh is a thermometer. That already gets us to think. We chose that image because Deleuze mentions this piling of stones along a road where we each leave a part and then move on to leave something behind to be worked on. So just a very quick image here that Deleuze talks about, Pierre Bernard's nude in the bath. And basically, we'd like you just to pay attention to the color scheme. You know, there's a lot of talk about colorist, color fields, things like that. And be interesting to think about this in relationship to fields and problematic fields and individuation and so forth as well. but the way the color modulates and this relationship between form in a general sense and this openness. So as we get into thinking about this weird phrase, the monochromatic infinite, Deleuze and Guattari are going to talk about paintings. Okay, so they're always doing this kind of beautifully twisting work. Okay, so the flesh is not enough on its own. It needs support, and the term that they use for this support is house initially. The house takes part in an entire becoming. So think about wherever you are now or whatever your house is, and it's that and more than that, of course. It is life, the non-organic life of things. So that hooks nicely back to Borges. And this is a fantastic phrase, the non-organic life of things. In every way possible, the house creates sensation as defined by the joining of planes in accordance with 1,000 orientations. So this joining of planes, let's keep that in mind as we begin later on to think about dance, but also painting and architecture and the way thinking and writing works. The house itself or its equivalent, and that parenthetical expression is important, but we don't have time to talk about it right now, is the finite junction of colored planes. Okay, so here we have the finite junction, but we're very close to the infinite monochromatic. Okay, so here's another image from Soutine that Deleuze and Guattari mentioned, these series of drunken houses. And think about the Francis Bacon book, or Van Gogh or whatever, and this kind of movement of twisting. Art struggles with chaos, we know that, but it does so in order to bring forth a vision that illuminates it for an instant, and that's right now what he means by sensation. Even houses, Soutine's drunken houses, come from chaos, knocking up against one another and preventing one another from falling back into it. So there's this kind of odd mutual support that keeps things from falling back into absolute chaos. And then this idea of Monet and the slit, which of course, the slit and the umbrella from D.H. Lawrence is a motif that Deleuze and Guattari work on again and again. So the flesh is not enough. It's just a thermometer. The house gives support, even though it's a drunken house and kind of a Lucretian house, to support each other. And now the cosmos. This is not a sequence, of course. They're all intertwined with each other, and we'll have to think more about that. So ultimately, the universe appears as the area of plain uniform color. Plain uniform color, the great plane, the colored void. So we have a monochrome infinite and we have a colored void. How do these relate to each other? And this word in French of area of plain uniform color gets used very, very often in this chapter, aplat, A-P-L-A-T. So he's going to talk about a Matisse painting. The French window now opens only onto this area of plain uniform black. So that's the monochrome infinite. The flesh or the figure is no longer the inhabitant of the place, but it's a becoming. It's like a passage from the finite to the infinite, from territory to deterritorialization. So these passageways that art and thinking provide, that's what they do, is this passageway between finite and infinite and vice versa. So there's the Matisse painting, and I think this is a fantastic image. That black section is the monochrome infinite, whatever that quite means, but it's not infinity in terms of duration or extension. It's a kind of infinity of, I don't know, variation and intensity. So he's thinking about very specific visualizations and these cosmic concepts that meet on the plane of consistency. And finally, a painter is a choreographer of space, Barnett Newman. And as we all know, space is not a pre-given thing, but it's a way that we shape through the arts or through philosophy. And so Newman's thinking already, and many other people as well, about how painting is a choreography. So the next slide, I'll turn it over to Kanto and let her pick up here.
Hello, everybody. Thank you, Gray. So I'll start by making three very brief comments. As an Indian American hard of hearing choreographer and scholar, I've been moving increasingly toward an investigation of the multi-sensory, which blends together cross arts, cross abilities, and the cross cultural. My work investigates dance and design, ecology, heritage, and disability. I've been running Folded Paper Dance and Theater Limited for the last 12 years, doing work actually primarily in Hong Kong and India. I'm going to share with you a few images from my work. They raise questions about, quote, complex vectoral spaces and processes of what I will call for now hearing differently. So this slide comes from an experimental dance film shot on the rooftop in Tai Po, Hong Kong, where we are investigating We Carry the Water Hong Kong. We see here the dancers as the composition of shifting forces across the rooftop floor, against the rooftop wall, and against the sky overhead. The flesh of the dancers, already in the house of their movement phrases, holds fast against the architectures of the wall and the floor. Elsewhere in the film, not shown here, some of the dancers carry fish bowls, half full of water, a balancing act as they race from upstage to downstage or from the background to the foreground at various speeds over and over again. The fish bowls, the moving spheres of water, become their own sort of architecture. And then at the end of the video, a rusted water spigot, a part of the rooftop architecture, appears against a gray sky. There are several iterations of this project. One took up a project researching water access and water lorries in Angamali, which is in the northern part of Kochi, Kerala. And there we investigated the water lorry, the experience of the villagers when the water arrives to deliver water every 1 to 2 weeks. There, the hand, the body that carries the flush, the bucket, the hose, the lorry as the house, and everything around the water allows for the revelation of water as a monochromatic as it pours from the lorry hoses. Slide 2, the next slide, please. Very quickly, for Scythe indicates that a body is that which folds. He writes, speaks elsewhere, there's really no transition necessary, only a folding, a series of foldings and unfoldings that produce an infinite number of movements and positions. The squiggle that you see there comes from Laban movement analysis, which is a movement and notation system based on geometrical analysis. Laban noted that all movement is either gathering or scattering. His system in part informed some of Forsyth's work on improvisation technologies. The next slide, please. This is an installation at the Kerala Museum of Art and History in Kochi, where I was affiliated during my Fulbright Nehru Award in 2017-2018. As part of the 2-day symposium, I facilitated a lot of discussions on culture, heritage, and our future cities. Tracing Luminosity is an interactive dance installation with 3 performers, Indian performers, excuse me, further investigates processes of slowing down and engagement with the performance of everyday life and heritage through the staging of the variable monochromatic installation. As a geometric installation formed by white triangles and gray wire, a semi-geodesic dome-like construction, this monochromatic structure provides reflective surfaces for film productions, partial revelations of the dancers hidden inside the folds of the installation, or even for audience members to move inside and outside of the space. Flesh, house, and cosmos make each other even if they break those forms apart, depending on where you stand as you witness how the structure reveals and conceals through its interminable yet resonant white surfaces. The installation shaped by this white space was the site for interactive documentary videos of other research on Kudiyatam, Kalaripayat, and Daveli. The next slide, please. More recently, sounding bodies intermedia in Hong Kong involve the evolution of the dancer from the flash of an initial dance to an earth figure who or which dons an architectural costume that she wears as a part human, part building figure to her upside down double, a drunken version of Drunken Houses, to the rendering of pieces of architectural costumes donned by various dancers toward the end of the piece as they flail against the slowly emerging image of the geological heritage. Here, what you see on the left-hand side of the image, very far in the shadows, is the dancer in the architectural costume. She has an iPhone that's picking up the live feed. And so you see the doubling of her emerging into that space. This evolution is composition in the making of the flesh house cosmos as they merge together in one figure. And as sounding bodies unfolded, as I've already mentioned, the geology and dance begin to fold together toward the non-organic becoming. The next slide, please. This is a surreal hearing trumpet flower. This is an aesthetic composition of bamboo and paper that listens to and in nature. And back over to you, Greg.
Thanks, Kanto. So we wanted just to end with this non-human becoming before the era of the future, because the movement of percepts, affects, and concepts is this passageway, and that gives us a whole new range, as we all know, to think about different relations in the world. So we'll finish up here with just, again, Flesh, House, and Cosmos in this era of the future. A monument that is a work of art does not commemorate or celebrate something that happened, but it confides to the era of the future persistent sensations that embody an event. The constantly renewed suffering of men and women, their created protestations, and their constantly resumed struggles. So this idea of percept, affect, and concept, blocks of sensations and aesthetic composition, it moves us back into the quote unquote immediacy of the struggle, which is one way to think about abstract life. And so we'll leave it with there and then move back to Keith and his thoughts on abstract life and radical empiricism. Thank you so much.
And thank you very, very much for that. Again, there's many questions I have to give. But Keith, can we double check that your sound is reasonable?
Yeah, let's do that. Can you hear me?
Yes, absolutely wonderful. Welcome back to humanity.
Well,
Right.
Thanks, Geoff, for chairing the session, and thanks to everybody who just helped me out with the sound, and to the organizers for setting up this wonderful event. So my paper is called Abstract Life, Abstraction in Deleuze and Radical Empiricism. In his lectures on Kant, Deleuze tells us that once you reach the abstract, you reach the most fully living core of experience. True lived experience, Deleuze says, is an absolutely abstract thing. Abstraction is a fundamental process of life. It's not opposed to the concrete, but is the becoming concrete, or the concrescence, the extraordinary English word that Whitehead presses into circulation again, of reality. In what follows, I will bring together Deleuze's and Deleuze and Guattari's ideas on abstraction in the context of one of their best examples of it, life. I argue that Deleuze develops an approach to abstraction that is fundamentally vitalist. Everything I've written is vitalistic, at least I hope it is, he says. In the first part of the paper, I lay out their novel approach to abstraction, opposed to the abstract in the ordinary sense, as they say. In the second part, I articulate one of the key mechanisms of the abstract machine, what we can call the spatio-temporal continuum. And in the third part, I show how life is a process of abstraction across the continuum. Leaning on William James, one name for this approach methodologically is radical empiricism. and is best understood, in my view, in the context of process philosophy. Deleuze's approach is similar to other radical empiricists like Bergson or James or Whitehead. And in the longer version of this paper, I point out some differences between them in the way they think about some of their own key abstractions that relate to life. But I won't be able to do that today. So the first section then, in the Western philosophical tradition, the key image for thinking the abstract is the taxonomic tree of kinds, classes, and types. One moves up through levels of generality to the highest abstractor, and then down to ever more concrete particulars, instances, or tokens. Perhaps our best known example of this is the movement of the dialectic that Plato associates with Socrates. One must track down the higher forms or ideas in the things which participate in them, ensuring that the lines are pure and unmixed. This procedure operates in accordance with the fixed classes and divisions of the tree, and is guided by the question, what is X? One of the first examples of this in Plato is in the Phaedo, where Socrates shows his interlocutors how unequal sticks or logs communicate with the equal itself. For our radical empiricists, modern philosophy tends to continue a Platonism of the abstract, whether an emphasis on the reality of wholes, totalities, and conditions of a broadly construed rationalism, or in the centrality of atoms, parts, and individuals for empiricism. Deleuze and the radical empiricists give us another image of abstraction. Perhaps we should say an imageless image, not just a reversal or an inversion, but an overturning and a flattening out of the Platonic image. Perhaps William James's notion of pure experience gets close to this in some ways. Instead of an arborescent model, as Deleuze and Guattari would say, or form that subjects its contents to fixed movements of ascent to the genera or the totality, and descent to the particulars or the discrete, guided by principles of similarity, resemblance, and identity, the radical empiricists construct a different kind of abstract space, more rhizomatic, anterior to the up-down and high-low of the Platonic tree, compelling its components into movements of endless divergence and continuous variation. Such an abstract or logical space is unlimited, open, and larger than the highest phyla, and smaller than the smallest organism. In place of starting with abstract forms and asking how they are realized in the world or extracted from it, the radical empiricists ask us under what conditions something new comes into the world. As Deleuze says in his dialogues with Claire Parnay, the abstract does not explain, but must itself be explained. In other words, the abstract in the ordinary sense does not explain, but must itself be explained through a genetic account of its conditions. The abstract in the ordinary sense is not abstract enough. Instead of a process of extracting a pure form or emptying a space of its concrete content, Deleuze and the radical empiricists rethink the notion of the abstract as a living practice of philosophy, a mixing and growing together of elements in which the abstract draws from the outside, creating, quote, a line of variable direction that describes no contour and delimits no form, end quote. Second section. There are at least two types then, or models or practices of abstraction in the Western tradition. The first type that begins with Plato, and behind him Parmenides and the Eleatics, and remains more or less in place in much of modern philosophy. I will call this spatial abstraction. Spatial abstractions tend towards stasis, separability, identity, and the discrete. The second type, that perhaps goes back to Heraclitus, I will call temporal abstraction. Temporal abstractions tend toward change, relationality, continuity, and difference. For Deleuze and Guattari and the radical empiricists, these two practices of abstraction do not exist apart from each other. They are not oppositions as such, but inseparable forces or tendencies towards stasis and change at work within any reality. Every reality or experience to some degree expresses both types. Thus, we postulate a third type of abstraction, spatio-temporal abstractions. One way to describe spatio-temporal abstractions or multiplicities is in terms of the becoming space of time and the becoming time of space. Bergson's famous term for this is duration, which Deleuze glosses in his Bergsonism as the division of the present moment into two asymmetrical jets, quote, one oriented and dilated towards the past, and the other contracting towards the future, end quote. This splitting of time is present in most of the radical empiricists in different ways, and each will insist that the splitting is an ongoing activity which cannot be recomposed from the two jets and added together. Nor can the splitting be understood independently of space. The splitting of time is necessarily spatial, since succession tends towards extension for the relation between past and future to be expressed. This opens the possibility of a radical reconceptualization of matter and life along a spatio-temporal continuum. However, for the most part, for the radical empiricists, Western philosophy has favored practices of abstraction of the first and the second type at the expense of the third. The basic principle at work here for Deleuze and the radical empiricists is that philosophical problems exclusively conceptualized in terms of either spatial or temporal abstractions must be rethought and rearticulated as spatio-temporal abstractions in order to avoid all kinds of illusions, that's Deleuze and Guattari, or fallacies, that's Whitehead's term, or false problems, that's Bergson's term. So the third section then, one of Deleuze's and Deleuze and Guattari's best examples of a spatio-temporal abstraction is life. For them, we can live nothing but the abstract. As Deleuze says, quote, the abstract is lived experience, end quote. A lived experience that represents nothing. What I live is 1,000 spatio-temporal lines, plateaus, intensities, or dynamisms that are completely abstract. And one way that these abstractions are expressed is through what Deleuze and Guattari call rhythms. As Deleuze says, quote, what could be more abstract than a rhythm, end quote. Abstract rhythms are constitutive of organic and non-organic life. They are variable degrees of contraction and relaxation, territorialization and deterritorialization that range across the strata of the physical, including the most elementary physical events. For example, Deleuze says, quote, one should therefore conceive of micro-intervals even in the primeval soup, end quote, as well as all the differential levels of consciousness and beyond. Deleuze and Guattari constantly return to this idea of life, both organic and non-organic, as constituted by abstract space-times, movements, or rhythms throughout their work. For example, in the opening pages of chapter 2, Indifference and Repetition, Deleuze begins by citing Leibniz's famous thesis of the mens momentaneia. For Leibniz, matter is instantaneous mind, without recollection of a preceding moment. The nature of the physical for Leibniz is that at each moment, it is external to the past and to the future. Leibniz contrasted this with mind as a present that merges with immediate memory, or a mind that repeats the past with a difference. However, by calling matter instantaneous or moment, Leibniz points to, but without taking up, a possible new conception of the relation between the physical and the mental, the inorganic and the organic. Deleuze picks up this notion and Indifference and Repetition considerably deepens it in terms of a repetition for itself that takes place in the mind prior to any active memory or reflection. This is what Deleuze calls a lived or living present, a synthesis of time that contracts the supposed successive independent instants into one another, so that the past and the future are not separate instants distinct from the present, but dimensions of the present itself. Every organism is the sum of its contractions, its retentions and expectations, and is defined by the problem of habit. The habits that we contract and that we are, but also for Deleuze, habits are contractions in the contemplating mind. Quote, it is simultaneously through contractions that we are habits, but through contemplation that we contract, end quote. The abstract spatio-temporal rhythms of organic life vary according to, and this is a quote, according to the natural contractile range of its contemplative souls, end quote. Deleuze describes here rhythms of an organic present that varies from species, individuals, organisms, and the parts of organisms. Deleuze uses the example of wheat as a contraction of earth and humidity bound to the rhythms of contemplations, just as the lily of the field sings the glory of the elements that it contracts in contemplating. Deleuze writes, quote, all our rhythms, our reserves, our reaction times, the thousand intertwinings, the presence and the fatigues of which we are composed, are defined on the basis of our contemplations. The rule is that one cannot go faster than one's present, or rather one's presence, end quote. Now, much of this analysis is carried through with little change in terminology to the conclusion of Deleuze and Guattari's final book, What is Philosophy? But what we also find in the texts of the 70s and 80s is that Deleuze and Guattari increasingly insist on speeds that do exceed one's presence and indeed surpass the movements of organic life. Such speeds tend to expand the rhythms or spatio-temporal multiplicities that structure abstract life away from the extensive pole without ever leaving it behind completely. Rather than presence dividing into more extended or overlapping present, the present intensifies and its volumes would become more and more contracted, interpenetrating and distended as the tendency toward heterogeneity and novelty becomes more pronounced and as substance and form become more destratified. From this perspective, the organism, Deleuze and Guattari claim, is a limitation of life, that which life sets against itself in order to limit itself. And again, that's a quote from 1,000 Plateaus. In the deterritorializing movement between organisms, an abstract line emerges, a streaming, spiraling, zigzagging, snaking, feverish line of variation that liberates a power of life that organisms had confined. this non-organic life that gripped the world remains a spatio-temporal multiplicity that pushes the abstract rhythms to new expanded thresholds. In the cinema books, Deleuze connects non-organic life to what he calls the crystal image and the splitting of time that we described earlier as at the heart of abstract movement. In A Thousand Plateaus, Deleuze and Guattari tend to emphasize the spatial destratifications that characterize the smoothing of space and the abstract lines, which are ceaselessly bifurcating and diverging and cutting across the assemblages. In all of these cases, we see stratifying movements of the inorganic and the organic, and destratifying movements of the organic and the non-organic along a spatio-temporal continuum. In effect, Deleuze and Guattari redefine life as a new type of abstract movement, of abstract space and time. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for that. It's excellent timekeeping as well for all of them. I was going to say that I think people probably have, at the moment, there are no questions in the chat. I think people are gathering their thoughts, and probably one of the most abstract panels I've actually had the privilege to be chair of. Well, I was going to say, I think all the presentations did go together quite well. They worked actually very wonderfully to think about what is the nature of the abstract, whether that's in literature, in Borges, or in art. And we saw excellent examples in Monet and other artists, and also in the history of philosophy, so excellently presented by Keith. Well, I have some questions. If there are no, does anybody want to jump in and ask some questions? Because I'll take my privilege otherwise. Manoj, do you have any thoughts?
No, Geoff, go ahead.
Right, okay. Well, hopefully we get a few questions, okay. But I think if I might start with the first presentation, I'm kind of confused about the idea, Dr. Bernal, about weapons that's not men. What is it? Weapons not men fought. So it's the weapons fighting. Now, I'm forgive me, but I would, if you could possibly kind of go over that again for me, so I can have some kind of understanding of it. Is that possible? Could you just spell it out again? Your mic is off.
Sorry. In the story, there are two weapons. And in those weapons is the energy of fight that couldn't be, couldn't accomplish by the first owners of those weapons. And then in the second, not owners, because they are watching a collection, Duncan and the other character, they are watching a collection of weapons where those arms are. And when they choose them, the force that exists in the weapons moves them to fight. Mm-hmm. That's the meaning of the story.
Right. So that's the idea of Baroque grammar. So I was wondering, what is the nature of the weapon? It's not a subject anymore? Is that how you understand it? The weapon isn't the subject anymore of the weaponizing, as it were. Is that how it works? Yeah,
the intention of the characters is not to fight, but when they take the arms, the will that there's in those weapons invades them, and that force makes them fight. So the objects have a more powerful will than men. That's what Borges intend to show in the story.
Right, but I kind of got that. I was just wondering about the nature of the sentence, how it goes together. because when I was listening to you, I was thinking about the problem that Heidegger had in his what is it, his inaugural address in the late 1920s. But we have this translation into English of nothing noths. You know, of course, the Oxford kind of language people got very kind of snobby about that and said that's kind of meaningless philosophical like nonsense. So can you defend that kind of weapons not meant for against that kind of charge of metaphysical kind of nonsense?
Well, maybe I'm not a Heidegger reader. I don't know him in depth, but I think that the idea is more or less the same as you explained it. That objects take the action in charge instead of men, and that's why I related this with the life of things, right? Because things become independent of men, and they start doing something that is not expected to be their line of action. It's like it's a Mayan myth in the literature of Mayas. When gods abandon men, then things reveal to men and start attacking them. So. And I think Borges took this idea from the myth, I think, because he liked very much this kind of, this specific story of the Mayans.
That's fascinating. I've got to dig much deeper into the Leibniz and the philosophy of language to draw out a really excellent kind of presentation. I've got to read Borges as well, to be honest, to be honest with you. So I've got a lot of homework to do,
Yeah, you're going to enjoy it.
I wonder too, if we took your question, Joff, back through the logic of sense, where he talks a lot about battles, and then that would take us into Keith's domain of spatiotemporal, radical empiricism, because then you have to have two types of time. One is, aeon and one is chronos. And so in the battle, people get cut. I'm not talking about Borges per se, but the meaning and the sense of the battle is not cuttable. And then we could connect that to the wound and living the wound in different ways but anyway, I think that's an interesting question about the inorganic life of things, and combined with time and certain types of meaning production.
Right, I think though in that way, as you said, that would connect with non-organic kind of time, would connect with Dr. Wannell's presentation, though yours presentation would go well together. I had a question about your, absolutely fascinating, and you were very quick as well, and it's a shame really when you finished, but could you just remind me of the painting of when you talked about infinity and blackness? Which was that, the Monet one?
No, that was the Matisse. I mean, so they're talking about all these paintings as related to monochromatic infinity, but I think as continual variation, to pick up on some of what Keith was saying. And so the Matisse window was the one that, I pointed more directly to, that black central space. So on one hand, all it is paint. And on another hand, it might be a window, but it's also monochromatic infinity. That strikes me as very intriguing. I don't understand all of what there's going on there, but I think they're trying to avoid, the spatial abstraction and the temporal abstraction, to do something different with that space of painting and the space of art that is always aesthetically composed for certain creative blocks of sensation reasons.
Well, I actually have Kojev's kind of the biography there, you see, The Black Circle. Okay?
Fantastic.
So I was thinking, how would do you know this painter? It's Julia Krasnersky, right? I think.
I don't know, but I will look.
Right, so it's kind of thrown me a little bit. I have to go and start looking at it again, So some more homework, really.
Yeah, we've all got infinite homework.
That's right. Well, do we have any questions or anyone to throw something in there?
I'm just glad that the word rhythm got mentioned. I think there's an enormous amount to think about rhythm in all of the papers and this entire field, but for another time, because I know David and Jeff have a plenary coming up.
Well, I think we should have some. It'd be rude not to ask Keith for some thoughts. But Keith, I was wondering, like when you were talking about radical empiricism, whether I mean, what's your take on the kind of idea of transcendental empiricism? I mean, how do you situate that kind of idea? Because you were talking about somehow wondering, I was thinking about how you would escape the illusions and falsehoods and problems as you kind of set out in a series of thinkers, when the idea of, transcendental empiricism, well, I mean, it's a question of experience and actually something not to do with the possible, right? So obviously you were talking about thinking beyond Kant there, but something to do with the real. So I was wondering, could you, because you do mention William James, and William James, whether William James is a philosopher or a psychologist, and I mean, do you have any thoughts about that? Or?
Well, the idea of transcendental empiricism and the way that Deleuze talks about it, he talks about it, of course, in that paper that comes right at the end, the A Life paper, which I think you're going to be talking about shortly.
Right.
But Deleuze and Guattari do also embrace the label in what is philosophy of radical empiricism. I'm not sure if there's that much of a distinction between them in that when, for example, James talks about the notion of pure experience, it seems to me, that's what they're embracing, that notion of a kind of field, a transcendental field that's, if you like, purified of all of its kind of contents, and one's going back to something like a set of genetic conditions. I mean, that is radical empiricism, at least in the terms of how I understand it. And I think that's the connection to transcendental empiricism, right? That Deleuze is talking about. It's the idea of trying to connect with these spatiotemporal, in terms of my paper, spatiotemporal conditions of reality or of life or experience, whatever it might be. And that's very similar to William James, right? What is James trying to do other than clear the field of experience of all of those abstractions that get in the way of us thinking pure experience, right? I mean, it's the same kind of idea, I think, or at least this is the way I think Deleuze reads the notion of radical empiricism. And it differs in, you get different versions of it. I think Bergson's a kind of radical empiricist as well, but you have phrases like superior empiricism that he uses, but it's the same kind of idea, I think. They're all in the same neighborhood. And Whitehead too. Whitehead's a kind of radical empiricist, and they're all sort of in the same neighborhood, doing the same kind of project. They're all trying to, if you like, overturn the standard ways we think about abstraction, the kind of notion of abstraction in the ordinary sense, in order to, rethink these notions of abstraction that are much closer to concrete life, right? Or a life, or transcendental experience, or transcendental empiricism. I mean, I can probably go on if you want me to, but does that use up some of our time?
No, it's not like that. It's absolutely fascinating. It's, what about religious experience and things like that in William James? I mean, how does one kind of, how do you treat that in terms of radical empiricism?
Yeah, I'm kind of less keen on talking about religious experience and that side of James's work. Be interesting to think about Deleuze would engage that and deal with that. I think it probably connects up quite well with some of these things that Deleuze says about the nature of, you know, we've lost belief in the world. Right? You might be able to make some connections there with what some of the things that James says about religious belief. You know, that whole sense that, I mean, Deleuze talks about it in interviews and in various places. It's a theme that he comes back to, right? That we've lost our belief in the world. We've lost our belief in the, you know, in the lived texture of reality, in some sense, the movements of the world. We've lost our belief in, and you know, in some sense, I think part of what Deleuze is trying to do is restore that faith or belief in the world in terms of its open movement and developments and so on. So, but yeah, I haven't read a lot of that James stuff. So certainly on religion, religious belief. The Will to Believe, right, is the book you're talking about.
Well, anyway, you know, this is, I mean, if nobody else is going to jump in, but I was just wondering whether, you know, the idea of radical empiricism, okay, and we're treating William James, and do we not kind of fall back into kind of psychological understanding of this kind of experience, like you mentioned?
Yeah.
How does, I mean,
maybe.
what is the, how do you get out of the phenomenological kind of trap, you know, I mean, regarding...
Well, isn't that what pure experience is? I mean,
right.
You know, what is James doing in all of those texts where he's talking about the very nature of what pure experience is? And it seems to be much closer to something like a metaphysical claim, right? That he's moving away, much like, one could argue, much like Bergson does. You know, his first book, he moves away from a purely kind of psychological set of claims about the nature of space and time and begins to develop them metaphysically. It extends the kinds of arguments and points that he makes in the psychological work and then extends them into a kind of sort of metaphysical claims about the nature of reality. And I think you could make those kinds of claims about James, that he is doing metaphysics in a way, certainly when he's talking about the nature of pure experience, right?
Well, sounds like more homework for me then, doesn't it?
It does sound like, Joff, you've got a lot of homework, but maybe you could give us a little bit of advance, you know, some advance on your paper that you're going to talk about in terms of A Life, because I think it ties in with my paper really well. And I think it ties in. I wasn't able, unfortunately, to hear very much of the second paper for obvious reasons, but it certainly ties in various kinds of ways, I think, with the first paper as well. Yeah. At least the idea of A Life. I mean, what do you think? Is A Life, is it close to something like pure experience?
Well, you're going to find out any minute, aren't you?
Oh, he's going to deflect all the questions. Okay, very good.
That's right. Yeah. Right. So we're getting up to around the time. Manoji, what is the procedure next for?
You can end the session right now, conclude it, and then we will go forward.
All right. Okay. And then we start. At what time do we start back? Is it
soon after 11:10 itself? Do you need a break in between?
Oh, we might go to the loo, actually.
Okay.
Sorry. Right. 2 minutes.
Fine. Absolutely.
Right. Okay.
Yeah.
Right.
Typical Joff.